Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new. It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people, and to the still larger cause of humanity.
Hello everyone, and welcome to India Colonized, a podcast dedicated to South Asia's modern and contemporary history. I am your co-host Ritika Chauhan, and you're listening to Guftagu, a special series where we discuss and engage with varied authors and scholars of South Asian history. In this episode of Guftagu, we have with us Dr Himanshu Jha, author of the book Capturing Institutional Change, the Case of Right to Information Act in India. Dr. Himanshu Jha is a faculty in the Department of Political Science at the South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University in Germany. His major interests could be located in the areas of politics, policy, and history, and thus his empirical and theoretical findings can be based at the intersection of all three. In his new book, Himanshu Jha traces the story of the events and decisions that led the Indian government to change the norms of secrecy to transparency. That is, the book examines the case of the Right to Information Act 2005 as a transformation in the information regime. Based on the historical archival material, internal government documents, and interviews, the book argues that the RTIA was a result of an incremental, slow-moving process of ideas emerging endogenously from within the state right since independence. By bringing in new evidence that was ignored in the mainstream literature, this book problematizes the dominant and somewhat settled narratives, unpacks and explains the politics of institutional change, and attempts to set the history straight. This interview explores and rightly examines the provided stances in the book, along with other broader perspectives of when and how does policy change happens in Indian governments, and other intricacies that lead up to major transformations within institutions. Here's the conversation with Dr. Himanshu Jha. Welcome, Dr. Jha. We are absolutely glad to have you on board at IC.
Thank you, Ritika. Good to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Right. So as we proceed with our interview, so for the sake of our listeners, I'd want you to tell us a bit about yourself, your intellectual journey, and somewhat about your areas of interest.
So I did my, I belong to Delhi, basically born and brought up in Delhi. I did my undergrad in history honors from Delhi University, did my master's from JNU, went to Australia to complete my MPhil in public policy. And then for 7 years, I actually worked in the development sector in India, running this policy think tank called Social Watch. And before moving on to do my PhD from the National University of Singapore. So I've got this, as you can see probably in the book, there's a unique blend of history and political science and theory, where I will also locate my research, at the moment, where, you pay due respect to the area, you pay due respect to the field, but also make some conceptual points, So there's a kind of a fusion between praxis and research, and that's where my future research is going. That's where the future lies.
Sounds absolutely interesting, Dr. Jha. So could you just tell me, how has your entire journey been while, putting this amazing book out? Were there any sort of limitations that you had to face? Because specifically while I was reading the book, it is also mentioned that a major lot of book has also been, based upon the archival materials that you had to, gain access to. So were there any sort of limitations that you had to face, and what was the entire process of putting this book out was like?
Yeah, no, I think I was probably lucky in laying my hands on a lot of material which was probably not part of the mainstream narrative about the evolution of RTI. So that way I was lucky. But having said that, digging that material was also a major challenge, getting my hands on some of the material which was not there. Some of the material which I would have loved to reveal in this book, which is mentioned, I could not just get access to those files. So, for instance, during the Janata Party government, there was this committee constituted by then Home Minister Charan Singh about whether to amend the Official Secrets Act or give citizens some kind of access to information. That file I just could not locate anywhere, whether be it Home Ministry or archive. So there were files which were missing. There was information which were missing. There were items of information which actually I had to trace back to the actual source. So these are some of the challenges in the field that I faced. Of course, I've been kind of lucky in the sense that I've been able to kind of locate most of the material, get some files with helps of a lot of wonderful people in the field who were actually ready to help. So it is just not my journey; it is also a journey of those people who have helped me write this book. Giving me access to the material that they had, but also giving me hints to where should I find those materials. So, and I've acknowledged most of them in the book. So I should not name all of them here, but they are acknowledged in the book appropriately.
I'm really interested to know, what is it that actually drew you to this entire project?
There's a backstory to it, Ritika. As I already told you, I was working in the development sector in India for 7 years. And I was, involved in the process of monitoring the institutions of governance, and because we were doing this monitoring, accountability was something which was big for us as a group. And we engaged with accountability. We also engaged with asking questions from the government because we were monitoring the institutions of the governance. Of course, the organization's name says it all. It was called Social Watch. And, during that time, around 2004, 2005, there was a whole plethora of rights which were legislated by the state, MGNREGS, right to information, later on, right to education. And so these were exciting times because, these also these times also signify that there was a move from the needs-based to the welfare system, which was more rights-oriented welfare system where citizens actually had rights. So we were, of course, kind of thinking deeply about this when I was working in the development sector. And in fact, I remember with UNDP, in partnership with UNDP, we had organized this workshop on right to information users, where people who had actually used right to information came to Delhi and they told us stories, gave testimonies about how they use right to information. And they were not activists, they were like common people, some of them also from the disadvantaged section. So that was fascinating. And also there were, how did these rights came about? They were like settled narratives, right? There were narratives which were accepted by everyone. And yet from this hunch, we knew that there's something more to it, and this kind of curiosity led me to, led me back to the so-called drawing board to connect the dots. And I was fortunate to get a fully funded scholarship at the National University of Singapore to actually pursue this line of inquiry. And that's how in its nascent form, the idea came about.
Right. That absolutely sounds super interesting. So because there was this entire process, how you came up with this entire, idea, and then there was this entire process interesting process of you putting down this book. So, what were, these some interesting new things that you actually discovered since the book has come out?
So this is about what, the RTI or,
the entire book specifically, and also what sort of impact that your book has held after it has come out?
No, so the book has got somewhat of traction in the mainstream Indian media, where things which were not known about the whole narrative about the evolution of RTI were revealed through this book. So, for instance, long before print carried a story focusing on the Janata Party period, where long before the RTI Act was promulgated, Janata Party had constituted a committee to examine whether the Official Secrets Act should be completely abolished and then there should be something like access to information given to the citizens, whether the state should be more open, or there was a private member's bill on freedom of information tabled by a member of parliament in way back in 1983. So these are some of the kind of sequences which are hidden in the mainstream narrative, which attracted attention from both the journalists, activists, and the academics alike. But this book is also doing something conceptually, in the sense that it's contributing to the broader literature on institutional change. How do institutions change in a liberal democracy like India? Is it just driven by the dominant interests on the ground, or is it just driven by the elite interests, or is it about a weak state captured by the nexus of vested interests kind of view, right? So this book actually tells you about how institutions change in a liberal democracy like India, and give you a detailed account about the uptake of policy ideas within the Indian state. So it kind of also unpacks the processes within the Indian state, which is somewhat of a kind of a parsimoniously treated area in the academia, right? Also, in the institutional change literature itself, this book kind of brings in a case from a developing emerging economy like India, because mostly the institutional change literature is dealing with developed economies or industrialized countries of the West. Very few have actually dealt with examples or cases from the emerging economies or developing economies from the global South. So this book is also contributing in that area, where it's looking at institutional change. How does institutional change occur in the countries of the global South? And also it brings in a case which is outside the economic realm. So most of the stories on institutional change relates to the political economy or economic change, right? Institutions of economy which change. But this book actually brings in a case from a social rights perspective. How does social change occur, so to speak?
Right. So, that absolutely sounds pretty interesting. So there is this very different alternative narrative that you've actually put out in your book. Could you just tell us what is that particular methodology that you used to build this entire concrete narrative, alternative narrative that you've actually established in your book?
Ritika, before I answer that, let me also tell you something about why RTI is unique. I was talking about the institutional change. I was talking about the plethora of rights, right? The bouquet of rights, Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, right to information, right to education, and yet right to information is different, because, right to information represents a norm shift. Something which was illegal, a cognizable offense, was actually signifies a norm change from the norm of secrecy, right, to the norm of openness. So there was a rearrangement in norms, rearrangement in both formal and informal norms, right? The second thing which happened is, unlike the other rights-based legislations, right to information did not have a policy precursor, right? So for instance, Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, there was a precursor to it in form of Jawahar Rozgar Yojana, Employment Guarantee Act in Maharashtra. Right to education, there is a precursor of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. So there are policy precursors to other rights-based regime. In right to information, there was no policy precursor. If at all, right to information represents a policy departure, right? It was a legal offense to both give out and receive information from within the state, right? The third thing which has happened is that Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution itself was expanded or reinterpreted to inherently contain right to know or right to information, right? So right to information was part of that bouquet of, that cluster of rights which was legislated way back in 2005, 2006. And yet it was different because, the changes were quite institutional. And that's why I treat right to information as a case of institutional change and not other rights as case of institutional change, right? But right to information also poses a puzzle, right? So why did a state, ushered in a change in the legal regime, which was persisting right since independence, and even amended to a stronger version in 1967 after following the India-Pakistan war and India-China war, right? Puzzle deepens even more when we kind of take into account the view of Indian state as one which is captured by the nexus of vested interests. Why would the state change a legal regime which would be used to highlight and expose the very nexus which is set to govern these institutions? As we can see, RTI has been instrumental in exposing most of the major scams in India, right? Right since 2006, 2007, major scams in India have been exposed through RTI. So why would the state, open up to scrutiny through RTI? And so it poses a puzzle for us, right? How it is different from the mainstream narrative. Methodologically, what this book does is it kind of redefines the path of departure, right? So if you're talking about an outcome, if you're talking about an institutional change, you have to kind of trace it back to where it originated from, right? And so most of the narratives which are, and the mainstream narrative is mostly around social movement, which emerged in early 1990s, or there's another dominant explanation which says that, there was a consequential role of a dense interpersonal elite network. Or third view is that, there was a political opportunity, pro-RTI regime came to power in 2004, and that's how RTI came about. Now, most of these narratives actually view that RTI was a result of a social pressure, right? There was a grassroots movement, and that kind of led to right to information, or in this case, institutional change. But if you read, and most of them start from the late 80s or 1990s, right? Early 1990s. But, since right to information represents norm of openness emerged from the nested norm of secrecy. The secrecy persisted in India for a long period of time, on top of which the norm of openness actually emerged through the promulgation of right to information. So if you redefine the point of departure, if you redefine the tracing of the outcome, that allows you to bring in a lot of new, fresh historical material, which is not part of the mainstream narrative or the dominant narrative, right? And so for me, then the starting point was the Official Secrets Act, because Official Secrets Act was something which represented the norm of secrecy at multiple levels, right? It also represented this logic which was driving the bureaucracy and the state for a long period of time, that all official information is key to protect state interests and national interests, right? As we all know, Official Secrets Act was a colonial legacy. This was part of the British rule, and was also kind of a law which emerged during the two world wars, right? And so surely it had clauses, it had articles which kind of was driven by this bureaucratic logic that all official information is key to protect state interests and national interests. After India became independent, Official Secrets Act was just adopted as it is, by just merely removing the references to Great Britain in the Act and replacing it with India. Not only that, it was accompanied by other laws, right? Civil Services Conduct Rules of 1964, Sections 1, 2, 3 of Indian Evidence Act, or Manual and Office Procedures of Government of India, which further weakened the right to know. Right to info, Official Secrets Act was actually amended in 1967 again to make it even stronger. Some sections of the Official Secrets Act was amended where, the right to withhold information, in relation to the parliament was actually even, executive was given power to withhold information from the parliament. Or some, Section 5, for instance, of Official Secrets Act said that, sharing and receiving information would be a non-bailable, cognizable offense. Right. So it had a colonial legacy. And that's why if you redefine the point of departure, that's how you will make the institutional change story complete. And that's why this book, I claim in this book that I present an alternative narrative or alternative explanation about the evolution of RTI. RTI is just a case to show how institutions change in a liberal democracy like India.
Right. So, like, as we've already, elaborated on how this transition, sort of took place from this, norm of this secrecy to this norm of openness, and you very well represented that in your book as well. So, which you've also sort of elaborated on. There are different sets of layers that are there when we talk about this transition from norms of secrecy to this norm of openness that came about. So, could you just walk us through this layer of specific political development and what were the basic influences of it, and how the idea of freedom for information moved from opposition, because as you've already explained in your book, that because it was actually it bore somewhere in the opposition party. So how did it move from opposition to the mainstream, and what were the political developments that took place during that year that actually influenced the entire part of it?
Thanks, Ritika. That's a very searching question. And, I'm afraid my answer is going to be long and rambling to that, because that forms the core of the book. I would start by saying that if we go by the definition of institutions as formal, informal norms, RTI represents a kind of a norm shift, right? From the norm of secrecy to the norm of openness. Having said that, institutions also have a bad habit of persisting on the historical landscape, because institutional persistence kind of leads to the creation of elaborate social and political networks which persist along with that institution as well. So Official Secrets Act persisted in India for more than 60 years before RTI was actually promulgated in 2005, right since independence, even before independence. So there was kind of a huge network of vested interests, political and bureaucratic vested interests, which formed around this nested secrecy, where they gained from the institutional persistence, where they gained from secrecy, right? And so the governance processes or processes within the state were actually hidden behind the veil of secrecy. They were not known to the common public. For instance, it was not known to the common public that what is happening to their development programs. How does the state work? There were things which were hidden in those files which were not revealed to the public, right? And so institutions have a bad habit of persisting for a long period of time. And as we can see that in the case of the norm of secrecy, the Official Secrets Act was even amended in 1967, right, to an even stronger version. There was Civil Services Conduct Rules of 1964. As late as 1994, there was a push towards greater secrecy. In 1994, there was this amendment to the Manual of Department Security Instructions, according to which you classify any government file or document as secret, top secret, or confidential, right? That was amended to an even stronger version. And you would believe 1994 was also the time when, the 1991 economic reforms had happened. And so you would believe that the state would be more responsive towards the idea of openness, but it was not. So the norm of secrecy persisted for a long period of time. It was even kind of deeply entrenched within the system. At the same time, what was happening was that in the earlier phase, right since independence, there were rudimentary ideas on openness which emerged on the fringes. There were nascent ideas on openness, that the state should open up. So these kind of emanated from three sources, right? The first source were the government reports themselves. The report, there were committees which were constituted by the government. The reports of these government committees themselves hinted or tangentially touched upon the excessive secrecy in the government and need for kind of more openness of the state. So, for instance, in 1953, perhaps one of the first appraisals of public administration in India, which was done by a U.S. academic and Senator Paul H. Appleby, which is called Appleby Report. In 1953 itself, the report said that there is perhaps a tendency by the Indian government to excessively classify everything secret or confidential. There was this in 62. There was Santhanam Committee report, which also touched upon this. So there were reports of the government committee which actually from the 50s onwards expressed their opinion on the norm of secrecy. still nascent. The second source was the opposition, right? Because opposition always was denied this privilege of excess information from the, privileged information, access to privileged information from the state. And so, for instance, in 1965, there was this ruling by the Speaker of Lok Sabha. His name was Hukum Singh, that the parliamentarians can also quote from the confidential documents of the state, right? Earlier, parliamentarians did not have that right. And this ruling was triggered by an opposition member from Swatantrata Party. His name was P.K. Deo, who wanted to quote from the Union Subcommittee report and the report of the Central Bureau of Investigation, which was rather unfavorable to two former chief ministers of Odisha at that time. And so, he was denied that privilege to quote from that confidential document. And there was a big furor in the parliament. The opposition actually demanded that they should be allowed to quote from confidential documents as well. And, the speaker allowed it to happen. But of course, right after that speaker's ruling in 65, in 67, the Official Secrets Act was actually amended to an even stronger version, right? But there has been a push from the opposition itself. Right from the beginning. The third source was actually the judiciary, the Supreme Court, which approached the whole question of right to know or freedom of expression and speech, protecting Article 19(1)(a) of Indian Constitution, upholding it from the point of view of freedom of press. So right from the beginning. In the 50s onwards, you see that in this very nascent form, Supreme Court interpreting Article 19(1)(a) of Indian Constitution in new ways. That dissemination of information in the public domain is very important, right? But these were nascent ideas still on the periphery. So what was happening is that the norm of secrecy, which was nested, which was locked in at all the systemic level, was also, kind of challenged from the periphery through these reports, by the opposition and, by the judiciary. And so there was kind of a churning which had started right since independence between the nested norm of secrecy and the norm of openness, which kind of attained new significance when the opposition assumed power, right? So Janata Party was the first time that an group of opposition parties had actually formed power at the center. And this was also the first time that, a political party which was running for elections had promised in the manifesto that there would be greater openness and access to information given to the people, right? And Janata Party followed it up with kickstarting policy processes within the state as well. So as I told you, Charan Singh had constituted this committee. But so entrenched was this norm of secrecy that even when ruling party actually came to power in 77, they could not initiate any change in the system, right? But post Janata Parties, things started moving faster. You will see slowly the norm of openness, which was still on the periphery, slowly moved to the policy center stage. A lot of government reports which came during that time actually interpreted it, actually touched upon the issue of right to know directly, not tangentially as previous reports had done. I just told you about the private members' bill on freedom of information, which was tabled in the parliament in 1983. The judiciary also sharpened its stance, right? So it was SP Gupta case or Raj Narayan case. Judiciary actually interpreted Article 19(1)(a) as inherently containing right to know, right? So they actually used the term right to know for the first time. And so slowly the norm of openness which emerged on the periphery, or idea of openness which emerged on the periphery of the policy landscape, was moving to the policy center stage. And by the time National Front government came to power in 1989, what was on the periphery had actually become part of the mainstream. What was part of the opposition realm had become part of the mainstream. So National Front government constituted cabinet committees. The VP Singh himself had favorable view towards, promulgating something like freedom of information and right to information. There was a brief hiatus between 1991 and 1996 when the Congress party was in power. But 96 onwards, again, United Front government, when it came to power, initiated policy processes within the state. And so there was a mainstreaming of the idea, right, which happened 1989 onwards, and which reached I call it a tipping point in 2005 or even 2003 when freedom of information was promulgated. And so this is how, the norm of openness, which was on the periphery, the rudimentary ideas on openness actually moved slowly to the policy center stage, gained enough critical mass to effectuate institutional change. This happened in the case of right to information. This might not happen in other cases, right? So I think that's the long rambling story of how things actually how political processes within the state moved, and tells you about the uptake of ideas within the state.
Right. So, as you mentioned about, and you have also elaborated this in your book about this approach, this model that you've used to, present this alternate narrative of the tipping point, which you term as, to elaborate how this entire Right to Information Act that finally came through was, a gradual clumping of ideas that at a certain point in time, reached its threshold. And you elaborate on this approach basically while pushing against this notion of a critical juncture, which is to say, that things did not just exploded out of the blue. So what were those incidents that actually made you certain that, this case of Right to Information Act wasn't just a sudden throw-up of ideation, since, there were certain events that you've also mentioned in the book and also historically available, like that of, say, 1991 structural economic reforms or various other such examples that, they were observed, there were successful attempts to strengthen this criteria of secrecy. So all of this also sort of, in my point of view, sort of points out to these attempts that sort of kept pressuring until there was a surprising explosion. So does that not really establish this notion of critical juncture? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, Ritika, again, you have a habit of asking searching questions. So again, this answer would not be as long, but, what does empirical material tell you? What does the material that I have kind of brought about in this, brought to bear in this book tells you? Let us start by discussing what is, how do you define a tipping point? What are its main characteristics? And in my view, tipping point has got three characteristics. First, tipping point is, evolutionary, gradual, and largely driven by endogenous processes. You should be able to delineate small interlinked changes or sequences spread over a historical timeline leading to a certain outcome. And the third is that changes evolve over time, right? So this can be equated to something like an earthquake, where what seems sudden, like an earthquake, is actually a result of the tectonic plates shifting underneath the Earth's surface for a long period of time. Or you can equate it with, grass growing green, because when, the grass is cropped in, the former patch, there's a patch of mud, and slowly the grass takes root, and the former patch of mud is suddenly green. So what actually one fine day looks sudden is not actually, as sudden as we think it is. So Right to Information 2005 may look very sudden, may look as if there was a pressure from the international financial institutions, or may look as if there's a pressure from the social movement, which actually led to, or there was a political opportunity, a short window which opened up, which led to change. But my empirical material tells me that, the story is more towards an evolutionary line of inquiry, where, there was a long drawn churning of ideas, which was endogenously driven by, actors from within the state. There were government committees, members of the opposition party, judiciary, which were actually thinking about these issues. So there was churning of ideas for a long period of time. And in a way, this was also a political contestation of ideas between, secrecy and nested secrecy or locked in secrecy in the nascent idea of openness. And that's why I have said that it's a tipping point rather than a critical juncture. Now let's understand what is critical juncture. Critical juncture is when, there's a sudden window of opportunity which opens up, largely or primarily by an exogenous shock, where, the policymakers or stakeholders have this, in this window of opportunity, they have this short or brief period of opportunity where they can opt for a policy alternative, right? And after that policy alternative, after that policy choice is opted for, then there's a long period of persistence, right? This did not happen in RTI. This was not the case in RTI. In RTI, there was no sudden window of opportunity which opened up. Critical juncture is like this. You can equate it with meteor hitting the earth and the species actually, some species disappearing from the face of the earth suddenly, right? And then there's a long kind of persistence of certain species for a long period of time before another meteor hits the earth, right? This did not happen in RTI. And that's why I have kind of distinguished between the two schools of thought, the critical juncture and the tipping point. I've also engaged with the historical institutional literature where, historical institutional literature basically says that, there are interlinked sequences spread over a historical timeline, which leads to a specific outcome. So if you want to explain an outcome, you actually have to trace it back to these interrelated sequences, which have a consequential impact on institutional change, right? But they fail to take into account the role of ideas. So what this book does is it persuades us to take history, ideas, and historical processes very seriously. And that's why I had to distinguish between the tipping point, the evolutionary, the slow-moving model of change, to a critical juncture change, which is more sudden, which is more exogenously driven institutional change.
Right. Seeing how a Right to Information Act is actually, on its way of becoming headless now, would you suggest that, it was just a political opportunity that consecutive governments actually saw with increasing domestic social movements and international playouts for freedom of information at that point in time?
Riti, I don't quite agree that a right to information now is headless, in the sense that, yes, right to information, there have been efforts to kind of blunt the law and dilute the law, but I don't quite agree with the view. I wouldn't call it headless because, even after the 2019 amendment of right to information, there are agents of accountability who are actually using right to information quite a bit on the ground. And this is not only national level, this is also the grassroots level. So there have been efforts to dilute the law, but, the law is not headless because now law has actually hit the ground. And so it is in the hands of the citizens to actually give a push, so to speak. Of course, there are regimes which are, there was never a regime in India after the promulgation of right to information, which was actually supporting right to information. Exactly because of the puzzle that I told you about. Why would a state which is captured by the nexus of vested interest, so deeply penetrated by the nexus of vested interest, would open up to scrutiny, right? So there's a tendency from the state side not to open up to scrutiny, and yet there's a massive pushback from the citizens, right? You can also see it happening in COVID, during the pandemic, where government was very reluctant to put information out in the public domain, and yet there are agents of accountability who have been asking questions from the government, and there were a few things which were actually revealed through RTI. About your second question about the political opportunity of the various government here, I feel right to, there has to be a nuanced view to that, in the sense that there were political opportunities, but there were political opportunities right since independence, and yet there was push towards secrecy. So if there was a role of international financial institutions, IMF or World Bank, or the global best, the global financial institutions, we would have seen its impact after the economic reforms of 1991, right? But we all know that 1994 was the time when the norm of secrecy was actually even, entrenched more within the state. Pushed for more secrecy, right? The government during that time. So I feel that it is more of an evolutionary story where ideas actually emerged incrementally, endogenously, gradually. It was an incremental movement of ideas over a long period of time, which actually tipped over. It attained a certain political momentum, right? So you see, from 1989 onwards, most of the governments had actually initiated policy processes within the state to promulgate something like access to information or freedom of information. So National Front government, United Front government, the NDA government, and then finally, the 2005 right to information happened with the UPA in power. But a party which was resisting the idea of openness for a long period of time, such was the momentum and the weight of earlier ideas that it had actually converted in 2005. So I think it was the weight and momentum of earlier ideas rather than the political opportunity. Though I'm not saying, I do acknowledge the role of social network. In fact, I devote a whole chapter in the book, delineating the social movement, delineating the social processes. But I argue that had the state thinking not moved in a certain direction, they would have dealt with the same social actors in a very different way. So it was about the movement of ideas within the state, towards a certain mindset, towards a certain critical mass, that we should have something like this, that led to the promulgation of RTIA in 2005.
Right. So in this book, you very well, illustrate this narrative of epistemic network, how socioeconomic, political, and cultural changes at both domestic and international levels fabricated this entire network of institutional change at that point in time. So how far do you think the global changes in those times actually influenced the policy making in the state?
Yes, global norms played a consequential role. I do acknowledge the role of global norms, but it has to be seen in conjunction with, the discourse which was actually taking place, which I just talked about in the two layers, in the two phases that I was talking about. I actually make two arguments. The first argument that I make is about the norm demonstration, that, there were other countries who were promulgating similar acts or similar giving similar rights to its citizens. And it had a demonstrative impact on the ongoing discourse at the national level, right? So right since 1989, when the cabinet committees were being formed, what was happening elsewhere was actually being given some consideration within the government committees. They looked at laws from US, UK, Australia, so there was a demonstrative impact. Okay, so, other liberal democracies are doing it, we should do it as well. The second argument that I make is about what Amitav Acharya calls norm localization, where, you actually adopt, or you actually draw upon the existing laws or the various facets of the existing laws. But you don't just mechanically draw upon them. You are not like passive learners of these best practices. You are adapting it according to your local needs, discourse, culture, and political climate. And so similar thing was happening with the right to information in India. When the endogenous discourse was taking place, they were actually drawing upon these laws, best practices. So for instance, during the Shori Committee, which was constituted by the United Front government in 1997, they considered laws, they considered, on the disclosure clause, that what should be disclosed and what not should be disclosed, like file notings and intra-departmental notings. They actually considered the law, the US Freedom of Information law, right? Or whether the Right to Information Act should hold supreme over other laws, right? There's a section 22 in Right to Information Act, which says that, in case of a conflict with any other law, it is right to information which would actually hold supreme. If, when there was a discussion going on around this particular article or of the law, clause of the law, laws from UK, US, New Zealand were actually drawn upon, right? So there was a norm localization which was happening, and it had an impact on the ongoing domestic discourse. But, what is interesting is, that the role of global norms has to be viewed in conjunction with what was happening at the domestic discourse. So if the norm of openness was on the periphery, as I was just talking about some time back, it was still nascent. The role of global norms was also on the periphery, right? It did not find any kind of traction within the state. But as the state thinking had definitely moved favorably towards adopting something like right to information since 1989 onwards, you see a traction going on for the global norms as well. That global norms actually became important during that time. So this kind of challenges also the notion that right to information was homegrown and it was a grassroots. It was homegrown, and there was a push from the grassroots up. There was a kind of an impact of what was happening globally on the domestic discourse as well. But it has to be located in the context of what was happening at the domestic level, rather than just a mechanical norm diffusion happening from the global to the local.
Right. So when we talk, as you've also mentioned this in your book, and as we also trace the roots of Right to Information Act, it's sort of roots emerging from the colonial times. So there are various other colonial rules that still continue to live and breathe in the country. For example, if we consider the Sedition, do you think there can be a whole different institutional change that one could trace if this law were to gradually wear out, if Sedition law it were to gradually wear out? And do you think it would reach a tipping point? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, Ritika, I think the time has come for the archaic colonial law of sedition under section 124A to go. In fact, at multiple levels, the sedition law is similar to the Official Secrets Act. So sedition as Official Secrets Act, the seditious act are cognizable and non-bailable. And there are generic terms within the law, such as the hatred towards the state, or disaffection contempt, which can be construed in thousand ways. And this law as Official Secrets Act has colonial roots and has no place in modern democracy. It is also kind of closely related to freedom of expression and speech, right? If we is speaking against the state or having a critical view of what is happening within the state, can it be construed as sedition, right? So it has its colonial root, right? And similar to the right to information discourse, which was taking place in the country, the sedition law also has kind of seen a lot of discourse taking place around this law, right since 1950s, in the judicial cases, or the famous Kedarnath case in 1962, where judiciary was taking, a stance to uphold or not uphold Article 19(1)A. So it's the movement is not linear, and surely it again brings us back to the question of whether the state thinking has moved in a favorable direction towards an idea, right? So in this case of institutional change, which is discussed in the book, you can see definitely the state thinking had moved favorably towards adopting a norm of openness or right to information, right? In this case, the state thinking has not moved in that direction. In fact, from the 80s onwards or 70s onwards, you see, sedition law has been utilized by state in different forms and different ways, even till date, right? So the state thinking has not moved in the direction, but the similar processes outside the state are taking place. Judiciary is interpreting it in different lights. There's a social movement around it, like there was in right to information. But as I said, the state thinking has not moved favorably towards adopting a reformist stance on sedition law. They are dealing with the same set of judicial and social actors in a different way, right? So that's my view on sedition law, but it's a colonial law, it's an archaic law, and it has to go. There is no place for a sedition law in democracy. Of course, there can be reasonable restrictions to freedom of expression and speech, I agree with that. But, blanket deployment of sedition law is something which needs to be interrogated in a democracy like India. I think I forgot to answer your epistemic network question, Ritika. Did I?
No, you absolutely gave answer to that as far as I assume. It was very elaborative, thank you. So moving on, speaking of the contemporary times, when the Right to Information Law was actually passed in 2005, it was being termed as, one of the most revolutionary laws that would actually empower the people and, give them a hand to hold regimes accountable. But ever since the Right to Information Law was, it was passed, successive governments, one after the other, they have sought to suppress it in one way or the other. And it's quite evident in these times as well. So specifically in recent years, public authorities, affiliated with central governments have denied information to citizens under the laws or on matters of vital public interest, so to say. And even according to this report published by The Hindu this year, there was this steep decrease in the rejection of RTIs. But the major concern here basically lied in the ones, the RTIs which were basically rejected without giving any valid reason. So do you think, even though we might term this entire revolution of RTI as revolutionary, we might even say that, it was one of the most revolutionary laws that actually empowered people, and it still is empowering people. Do you think it might become a little directionless in the coming future? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
You are absolutely right. I mean, right since its inception, RTI, there has been a massive kind of effort from the state to dilute the law or blunt the law in one way or the other. And, the most recent amendment was a big blow to the Right to Information Act. And I feel there's a massive pushback from the citizens as well. As I was mentioning, even during the pandemic, citizens have been using Right to Information to get, at least at the central level, to get information on the supply of oxygen, on the constitution of the empowered committees by the government, the minutes of those committees. There was this recently news by the British Broadcasting Corporation about the use of PM funds and the procurement of ventilators across the state. And most of the information was procured through RTI. So even when the state is reluctant, there is a massive pushback from the citizens. And there are these core users of RTI. And I've, one of the other articles, I have used the term agents of accountability, where day in and day out, there's a massive pushback from a cluster of citizens, in not only at the central level, but at the subnational level as well. Every district has somebody who is actually day in and day out asking questions from the government. And this is a big power in the hands of the people, right? At the broader level, at the macro level, one has to see it, and as Nikhil Day calls it, the culture of secrecy or the culture of scrutiny is something which contextualizes this whole churning which is taking place at the moment. There's a culture of scrutiny now. People want to know what's happening with their money. People want to know what's happening to their programs. People want to know what are their rights and so on and so forth. So every district in India now has somebody who files RTI about local development programs, information about governance processes and so on and so forth, right? So there's a massive pushback from the citizen. So, if RTI was a result of this ideational churning which took place within the state, there's yet another kind of churning which is now taking place, where, this reluctance from the state to part with information is continuously being questioned and also pressurized by the citizens to kind of divulge information, which the state otherwise would not, right? So there's another kind of churning which is now taking place, which needs to be looked at. In fact, that's one of my future research projects as well. That who are these users of RTI? Why do they use RTI? What kind of information do they sort? So detailed, granular account of RTI use at the grassroots level. And also, what are the conditions under which the state opens up and shuts for the questions, right? What are the conditions under which the state shuts for further scrutiny by the citizens, right? So I think beyond the numbers, how many were rejected, how many RTI applications were rejected, pendency, and so on and so forth, we actually have to go beyond to understand that how are people engaging with this culture of scrutiny? How are people and citizens engaging with these tools of accountability? And so this is where the future kind of RTI lies, where the power is now in the hands of the citizens to ask questions from the government. And there are cases where people have actually pursued, even if they are refused information, they have actually gone up right up to the High Court and the Supreme Court to find their answers. And so there's still, I'm still positive about the power of RTI. There's a churning which is happening between the nested norm of secrecy and the norm of openness. But it is from this churning that this whole culture of scrutiny, accountability will actually emerge.
Right. So as if, very elaboratively trace this entire evolution of Right to Information Act, which is absolutely, mind shifting. It presents this alternate narrative that actually is completely contrary to what actually dominates the present world now. So Himanshu, what do you think is the relevance or association of your such elaborative work in the contemporary world, which is, ever changing and changing at a very fast pace?
I think conceptually it tells us about how it brings kind of ideas and the state back in the whole notion of institutional change, about how institutions actually change in a complex, diverse democracies like India, where there are different worlds which are existing within the same nation state, and so it tells us persuades us to take history ideas very seriously. So there's a contemporary outcome. And if you don't have a historical context to it, if you don't have a background of history backing it up, that outcome, the explanation or causal explanation of that outcome might not be complete and whole, right? And so I think that's something which is relevant to the policymakers as well, where, instead of, having just contemporary considerations, have a kind of a longue durée view of how to formulate and implement policy, taking into account the importance of legacies or ideas, is something which carries lessons for, I think, most of the developing parts of the global South, countries of the global South. And I think that's something which this book kind of takes us in that direction, where it has some lessons for the policymakers as well.
Right. So after this absolutely amazing work that you've put out, what are other projects that you're currently working on?
Right. Okay. So I think the first one the first thing I just kind of gave you a hint on that about how the use of RTI or use of right to information and the emerging politics of accountability on the ground is something that I would like to explore, going beyond just a kind of a macro view of right to information and how the government is backtracking and so on and so forth, kind of looking at both the demand and the supply side. From the demand side, you look at how RTI is being used, why people are using RTI, who are these actors who use RTI, and so on and so forth. But on the supply side also, have the change in, if there's a de jure change, it has also led to de facto change as well. What are the conditions under which the government opens up? Because there are puzzling instances where in some cases government voluntarily opens up and in some cases it just closes down. What are the cases? Why does it happen, and so on and so forth? Because there are, the state is not this big monolith. It has got different segments to it, and so one needs to kind of delineate it as well. So that is something which will, I think, I will be preoccupied with it in the next 3-4 years. But another project which is very important for me is about the state capacity, especially in the context of pandemic, where this whole question of state capacity emerged, and it's not just about general state capacity; it's also about state capacity in states which are considered, historically weak, right? And I feel that if you look at the emergence of state capacity in these so-called weak states, it will carry policy lessons for other weak states as well, but also within that weak state, it will carry policy lessons for other sectors as well. So that is something which I want to kind of go foray into in the next 3-4 years as well, where I'm looking at state capacity in weak states. Hopefully somebody would be, able to give me money to do that research, Ritika.
Right. I mean, that sounds absolutely interesting. And actually, I'm looking forward to, reading that, actually engage with that. So after this amazingly engaging session, I have this last question for you, Himanshu. This is completely for the sake of our young listeners. So for someone who wants to, explore political science and South Asian studies, or say global policy, what course of study and engagement would you want to suggest?
I think the first thing which needs to be understood is that you have to kind of locate your interest, locate your passion, what you want to do, and then look for appropriate courses which kind of match those interests, your field of study that you want to do. The second thing is that I also tell my students this, that you actually have to take something which you think you can manage. And this is not to say that you don't take on the challenge, but that's why the matching is so important, that you kind of take on something which actually matches your interests, where you would like to do something of that. And the third thing is that there also needs to be kind of some kind of homework, some kind of a groundwork about what are you looking for, what kind of possibilities are you looking for, because that will also, before you go in a program, before you go in that field, you already know about what you are kind of signing up for, so to speak, right? So some kind of a groundwork needs to be done to go in that direction, some kind of familiarity with this field. And the fourth thing is, you keep at it, even if, there are rejections, you keep at it and you will get it. And so that's my advice to young students. And also, most importantly, don't forget to have fun, because that will actually see you through when you are going through that whole kind of rigmarole, whole kind of exercise of locating the courses and matching those courses with your interests and so on and so forth. So it's not an easy formula, but this is how it is. And also for the young grad students who kind of want to write something, and I kind of go by this, is that if you want to kind of, don't cram all your writing till the end, right? In the end, I think this has to be kind of a regular habit of putting in a certain amount of words in your word file, say maybe 300, 400 words every day, so that keeps you in good stead for a long period of time, for a long duration, rather than kind of cramming it all up, in the last few months. It will also hone your skills, your creative skills in writing. And so that's, so it's this, writing is about all creativeness, but writing is also a little bit of clerical. You have to kind of be a regular file pusher, so to speak, when you are writing stuff.
Right. With this, we come, to the end of this absolutely engaging Guftagu with Dr. Himanshu Jha. Thank you so much, Dr. Jha, for joining us at India Colonized and giving this absolutely amazing insights about your book and presenting this, this set of narrative which actually very crucially challenges the dominant narrative that actually exists in this time. So thank you very much. We are absolutely looking forward to your new projects, and we are absolutely keeping an eye on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ritika, and also Omar, who is not here, for having me here and having me on this show. It was absolutely a pleasure to discuss all the facets of my book, but also about my academic life with you and on India Colonized.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this conversation with Dr. Himanshu Jha. We really hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please consider subscribing to our channel and podcast for more such amazing content. There's a series of such amazingly curated interactions with authors and scholars on the history of the subcontinent. Check out our website www.indiacolonized.com for more blogs and podcasts exploring the tales of India's contemporary history. Do follow us on our social media sites for more exciting updates. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.